So in the past, Sega has always had the hardware advantage over Nintendo, but it never meant anything because Nintendo's consoles had a better lineup of games. However, this was not the case with the Sega Genesis. When Nintendo released the SNES, Sega was suddenly in the back seat in terms of hardware. So how did the company deal with this? Well, let's take a look. What's going on? It's Podrez coming at you with another video. So we're going to be talking about the Sega CD and the Sega 32X. So if you've seen a couple of my videos and you like what I do, hit that subscribe button right there. And I just wanted to say again, we did reach that 10,000 subscriber mark. I just wanted to thank each and every one of you for helping me get there. And of course, I'm going to plug the Discord server. Just go to discord.podrez.net. I'll also put a link in the description. Alright, we're going to get right into it.
Tubes, dog meat.
There is no Nintendo CD. Understood?
Sega's original strategy of beating Nintendo was by having more powerful hardware. The Master System outclassed the NES in terms of hardware in nearly every way. If you compare two games on each console, the Master System wins almost every time. Later on, they did the same thing with the Game Gear. This console beats the Game Boy in almost every aspect. It was in color, it had a backlit screen, and the hardware was more powerful. So, if the hardware was better, why did both consoles lose to Nintendo? Well, better hardware means absolutely nothing if you don't have great games to go along with it. Nintendo had most of the third-party support, which meant Sega didn't receive some of the excellent games that defined the NES and Game Boy. There's a valuable lesson to be learned here. Better hardware does not mean a better console. Not only that, but a console with inferior hardware is still capable of holding its own. This is going to be important for later because there's one console by Sega that did not have the hardware advantage. In late 1989, after Sega didn't have any luck with the Master System, they released the Genesis. They were hoping that a 16-bit console with way better hardware would finally beat Nintendo. They also tried to get around the lack of third-party support by releasing celebrity-endorsed games and licensed titles from other developers. But it wasn't until Tom Kalinske became the CEO of Sega when we started to see some positive changes. Kalinske made the Genesis more appealing to consumers by dropping the price, making more aggressive commercials, and switching the pack-in game from Altered Beast to Sonic the Hedgehog. These changes greatly helped sales of the Genesis and finally put Sega on an even playing field with Nintendo. But roughly 2 months after the release of Sonic the Hedgehog, Nintendo would launch the Super Nintendo in the US. Suddenly, Sega was in the back seat in terms of hardware. The Super Nintendo outclassed the Genesis in most aspects. However, in the first couple years, Sega continued to battle Nintendo with decent results. Their commercials cleverly made the Genesis look more powerful by inventing the term blast processing.
The Sega Genesis has blast processing. Super Nintendo doesn't. So what's blast processing do?
The commercials never explained what it meant, so technically Sega was not lying to the consumers. This was a really smart way to market their product despite it technologically being inferior to the competition. When you compare two games on each console side by side, the Genesis actually held its own against the Super Nintendo. For a lot of games, you really couldn't tell the difference. Unlike the Game Gear and Master System where Sega tried to use hardware to beat Nintendo, the Genesis was doing fine in second place. However, Sega was afraid of the Super Nintendo for a few reasons. The Super Nintendo had Mode 7, which was a background layer that could be rotated and scaled. This allowed for 3D-like graphics and allowed for great titles like F-Zero. The Genesis didn't have this, and the console was not capable of anything equivalent to this. Secondly, Nintendo would develop the Super FX chip, which allowed games to render 3D polygons without much slowdown. And if these two things were not enough, Nintendo and Rare would team up and make Donkey Kong Country, which had revolutionary graphics for its time. Suddenly, the hardware gap between the Genesis and the Super Nintendo were much more prevalent. Because of these new innovations, this might have been why Sega started making some very questionable decisions. In the early 90s, CDs were becoming a very popular way to store media. The company NEC had already made a CD add-on for the TurboGrafx-16. CDs could carry more data than cartridges, so it became a more attractive option for game companies. Nintendo and Sony were also in discussion about making a new CD-based console. It seemed like this new way to store games was the future, so Sega began development on their own CD-based console. This would also give Sega the opportunity to fill in some of the gaps between the Genesis and the Super Nintendo. So, what could CDs do that cartridges couldn't? Well, in the case of the Genesis, CDs could carry 160 times more space than regular cartridges could. With all this excess space, you could easily fit in video and music files with much less compression. With a CD-based game, you could have very high-quality music and full-motion video, which is something cartridge-based consoles had trouble doing. In 1992, the Sega CD was released in the US. The unit wasn't actually its own console, but rather it was a peripheral that connected to the Genesis, so you needed a Genesis to play this thing. The add-on helped the Genesis look less bad against the Super Nintendo. The musical and storage capabilities were now much better than its competition, and the peripheral gave Sega an answer to Mode 7. So now Sega has a console that's better than the Super Nintendo, but as we've learned before, we need great games to go along with this. A lot of the games took advantage of the FMV capabilities, and it definitely does look really cool. There's a few notable games that use this technology. There's Sewer Shark, which was a first-person rail shooter. There's Road Avenger, where you're supposed to click the right button at the right time, or else you crash and lose. Time Gale is very similar to Road Avenger, where a button command shows on screen and you must press it quickly or else you lose. They came up with creative ways to utilize the FMV capabilities. In Night Trap, for example, you're supposed to look through surveillance footage and keep trespassers out. So some of these games are cool, but the FMV was more of a gimmick than anything. The games all have the same things in common. When you start, you're listening to someone who doesn't stop talking, and the game itself is basically a movie where you're not doing a whole lot of interaction. The FMV quality is also terrible. I mean, look at this. It's very pixelated and it doesn't even fit the entire screen. But to be fair, there were some games that didn't ride the FMV gimmick into the ground. The game Wonder Dog is a fun, colorful platformer that's fun to play. The game Sylpheed is a unique shooter that actually makes great use of the FMV capabilities. Because it's a Sega console, we must have a Sonic title on it, so we got Sonic CD. Thankfully, they didn't go overboard on the FMV stuff, so we get the same Sonic experience that we did on the Genesis. I love the artwork with a lot of the stages, and because there's a past, present, and future, there's actually a lot of content in this game. The CD quality music really captures the mood of the respective stage, and it sounds amazing. The special stages are also really cool, showing off some Mode 7-like graphics that Sega was desperate to include on this unit. This is a decent title, but it's far from my favorite Sonic game. There's no Spin Dash in this one, instead we got the Super Peel Out. It's like Spin Dash, but I prefer Spin Dash because your speed is based on how quickly you mash the button. Super Peel Out, on the other hand, has a much slower startup time, and it doesn't activate if you don't let the animation finish. Not as efficient. The bosses are also really weird in this game. They only take one hit to kill, and they went with really weird mechanics for each of them, like having to pop bubbles in order to reach the center. In general, the game feels more like a remake of Sonic 1 rather than its own standout title. Sonic 2 felt like its own game, but Sonic CD feels more like a rehash. Palm Tree Panic is like Green Hill Zone, Collision Chaos is like Spring Yard Zone, and Tidal Tempest is like Labyrinth Zone. I also don't think the past, present, and future gimmick is very interesting, and I never thought it added anything to the game. This is a decent title, but if you didn't have a Sega CD growing up, you really didn't miss out on much here. Thankfully, the game has been re-released numerous times, so there's many ways to play it without needing to own a Sega CD, if you're curious. By 1993, the Sega CD was not performing all that well. The console was too expensive, $300, not to mention you needed to own a Genesis too, and the library was very limited. The FMV technology was also not that great, and the console didn't upgrade the Genesis all that much. The non-FMV games still look like Genesis titles. Like I mentioned before, Sega didn't need to one-up the Super Nintendo hardware. They tried this trick with the Master System and it failed. They should have just kept the original strategy with the blast processing commercials and the impressive looking games. Why pay $300 for only a very small upgrade? Sega would discontinue the Sega CD in favor of the upcoming Saturn, but in between that time, they would make a very interesting decision. With the Super FX chip creating impressive 3D games on the Super Nintendo, Sega needed an answer to this, so they developed the Genesis port of Virtua Racing. They transformed the console into something we've never seen before. It's definitely not the best version of the game, but for Genesis standards, this was impressive. However, the chip that was used, the SVP chip, was not a sustainable option for future games because it was very expensive to produce. But this gave the developers at Sega an idea. Sega was preparing for a US launch of the Sega Saturn, but to hold over consumers, they wanted to give them a cheaper introduction to the 32-bit era. Sega also didn't want to inconvenience Genesis owners by making their existing consoles obsolete, so they began development on an add-on rather than a brand new console that was similar to the SVP chip. In 1994, the Sega 32X was released. Some of the games do look noticeably better than the Genesis. The 32X version of Virtua Racing is way better than the Genesis one, with more details in the graphics, more cars to choose from, and more stages. Virtua Fighter, while the graphics do look bad, it's impressive that they were able to pull off a 3D game like this on the console. There were also some non-3D games that are worth talking about. Sega made a few arcade ports for the 32X like Space Harrier and Afterburner, and they're all very definitive versions. These are the next best things to the actual arcade versions. However, a lot of the titles just look like Genesis games. The 32X expanded the capabilities of the Genesis a lot, but most of the games didn't take advantage of it. Imagine making this brand new console and most of the games don't actually use it. Like with the Sega CD, the 32X got a Sonic title, Knuckles Chaotix. This isn't your typical Sonic game because you actually play as two characters that are attached to a rubber band. You're supposed to make it through the game with both characters using the rubber band mechanics. The graphics are very nice and colorful, more so than other Sonic games actually, and the music is fantastic. Graphically, we do see some of the capabilities of the 32X, like the sprite scaling. There's a bunch of new tricks that you can perform with the rubber band mechanics, like calling your partner and performing a speed boost. The game definitely has that Sonic feel where it's very fast paced and it can be fun at times, but the rubber band mechanics are more of a hindrance because they slow you down. It feels like a Sonic game with an extra obstacle thrown in for no reason. And it's also disappointing that Sonic himself is not in the game, at least not as a playable character. From an advertising standpoint, it feels like more people would have bought this game and maybe the 32X itself if Sonic was in the title somewhere. This is a decent game, I would say even a little underrated, but definitely not my favorite in the series. Unlike Sonic CD, Knuckles Chaotix never got a re-release on any compilation, so your only way of playing this game is either emulation or owning a very obscure console that no one has. It's weird to think that there's two games that are super obscure just because they were released on consoles that nobody owns. The 32X was released one day before the Saturn came out in Japan. So yeah, while Sega was advertising the Saturn in Japan, they were advertising the 32X in the US. That must have been really awkward for Sega. Not to mention, the Saturn did come out roughly 6 months later in the US. Why even bother releasing the 32X when a new console is coming out in 6 months? The console had a very weak library of games. Only 40 games were released worldwide. What happened? Well, not many third-party companies wanted to make games for this thing, and like I've mentioned 100 times, you need good third-party games for people to be interested. Not only did third-party companies know better, but so did most consumers. It made more sense to wait for the next console rather than settle for this. The console would end up being a commercial failure. A lot of people lost trust in Sega after this console. So here's the big question. What's the big takeaway from all this? It's clear that Sega didn't learn their lesson from the Master System. Better hardware does not mean a better console. Even though the Genesis was technologically obsolete, it was still doing perfectly fine. Sega had the right strategy in the first couple years with their aggressive commercials and great games, but they got scared and started making add-ons that only slightly beat the Super Nintendo. But doing this only made people lose trust in the company. Hey, I just wanted to thank you so much for watching this video. If you made it this far, hit that like button. If you enjoy this type of content, hit the subscribe button for more content. Both of these things really help the channel grow. If you have anything to share, feel free to leave a comment. I read every single comment on this channel, and I'm pretty good at replying back. Anyway, have a good one.